Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is episode 12. And if this is the first time you're viewing, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. And yeah, you've presented or you've wanted to do a very spicy topic today.
Look, I thought it would be rather interesting. It's controversial talking about Ukraine and Russia and all this sort of stuff, but I think it's time for us to have a chat about it. Yeah, I'm interested to know what your thoughts are and opinions on it. Everyone seems to have an opinion on this. And I have been asked myself in the past, my opinions on this topic. And, like everything, I always make it related to revolution somehow. So, you know what you're going to get from someone like me. But yeah, I just want to have a general chat. I know it's a minefield, you can, really set off opinions and you can offend people left, right, and center. But yeah, I want to go there for IS. There must be, yeah, you must have some interesting information that you would have gathered over time and formulated some interesting opinions about this whole thing.
Actually, I do have a friend of mine who is Ukrainian, and well, her family has basically been directly affected by this situation. I was just talking to her the other week, and she let me know that her uncle and the sons, they're basically fighting in this conflict that's happening, and the wife of the wife, her aunt, and basically the daughters, they had to flee to a neighboring country. So, and plus, hearing her talk about this, and at least her explaining to me that how surreal the experience was, that this devastating I hope this isn't inflammatory to say, this like World War II-esque situation was happening to her family. And at least here in Australia, on the other side of the world, everyone's just going about their business like nothing at all is happening. It seems like it's a very surreal experience for her, that it's business as usual here in Australia when
Right, and she's here in Australia.
yes, yes, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Her family came to Australia a while ago, if I remember correctly, like back in the 80s and that sort of thing. And yeah, it just seems to be a very surreal experience for her, that, I guess for her family here in Australia, it's they're worrying about everyone that's in this conflict in Ukraine, and it's surreal that, well, on the other side of the world, a country is now being invaded, and it seems to be an extremely bloody conflict. And yeah, it seems like one day the Ukrainians are pushing them back. The next day, Russia is gaining more territory. But as far as the rest of the world is concerned, it's business as usual.
Business
And
as usual and surreal. And I like that little comparison there, because that's what a lot of this sort of stuff is, take the sticker of conflict off and apply it on any of the conflicts that have happened around the world in the last, 20 years or so. And that is the kind of the perspective that you get looking at it through the lens of the mainstream media. So, unless you actually have a direct connection, a primary source, someone who can give you, anecdotal accounts or evidence of what's actually happening over there. We all live in these kind of fantasy worlds when it comes to conflict and war, and then it becomes kind of part of identity politics in a way. So like you have people here, or you have people in countries where it is business as usual, and this is just something that you hear about on the news or in your feed or whatever it is, and you become associated with, I guess, your position on that conflict. That adds how it relates to your form of identity politics. And so, you hear about it on the news, and then you change your profile picture to some type of a filter with yellow and blue on it to show that you support Ukraine, or I guess red, white, and blue if you support Russia or something like that. And it becomes then part of, I guess, your political stance, as opposed to sympathizing with real people and real life-threatening situations, which is the surreal part of any type of tragedy or emergency situation, is when it becomes real. It's not a debate anymore. It's not a hypothetical discussion. It's not a war of opinions anymore. It's actually real people being affected by things that are happening on the ground, and things that I think can be analysed from a revolutionary or a very deeply geopolitical perspective, as opposed to just, this side good, this side bad, rah, 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 that kind of thing. And so, it's really interesting when you hear about people talking about things firsthand, as opposed to the media filter that we get on these types of issues.
Well, no, you know what? The way you've approached this, I think you've kind of approached this from a interesting perspective, and probably not a perspective that a lot of people talk about, is that people talk about the major actors. So they'll talk about NATO. So probably on the at least the Western side of things, the big actor that has pulled the strings, as probably especially with America's relationship or NATO's relationship with Ukraine, and like trying to convince them to join NATO. So people will talk about that, and then obviously people will talk about Putin and Russia. They'll talk about the big actors, but what not many people talk about is, well, the little guy, and like basically the workers, the people that are on the ground that basically have to suffer through these sort of conflicts and these sort of pissing contests, if you will. My army is bigger than yours. And I guess from that perspective, I kind of did get that sense from my friend when I was talking to her, because, initially I did come in with those kind of Chomsky talking points of like, oh, well, what do you think about, NATO? What do you think about America? And don't you feel like you're a puppet? Like, because basically what America and NATO have been doing is poking the bear of Russia. And I was at least coming from that angle. And she eventually told me this story of how in eastern Ukraine, there was a prior conflict. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, but this eastern Ukrainian province did provoke the ire of Russia. And she told me that the reason why this is so personal for Ukrainians, being invaded again, and the reason why they're fighting to the hilt, is that this province that stood up to them before it was just completely decimated. It was a crater afterwards. Like the Russians left left absolutely nothing. And this is like a secondhand recount that she's telling me. Like she's heard this from her relatives, that the reason why the Ukrainians and Zelensky has basically stayed there to be on the front lines is, well, they know the stakes. They know what Russia has done in the past, and they're not willing for the whole country to become a crater at the end of this conflict. And don't get me wrong, I'm a proponent of Karl Marx's dialectics. You have a synthesis, you have an idea, you have an antithesis, you have an idea that's opposing that, and then somewhere in the middle you create a synthesis. So basically you have one perspective, you have another perspective, and then somewhere in the middle is the truth. Like everyone kind of has this perspective, but at least from an outsider looking in, it was interesting to see the emotion and also the possible stakes that are in this conflict, because you being in such a globalized world, you don't think of genocide all that often, or mass murder, but here we are presented with that possible scenario, and it is quite harrowing.
I think they call it warfare, actually. I'm sure that's what it comes down to when two nations or large and very powerful imperial interests, or whatever you want to call them, come together and fight, and masses of working people die. I think, they call that warfare, not genocide, because that's a dirty term. But warfare is much more acceptable. You can kill millions in the name of warfare. And it is prestigious, I would find, because at least you're battling the evil other. And so it's well worth the masses of human loss of life, massive human loss of life. It's fine, it's acceptable, because of the W word. And like, that's a point that I like to kind of retreat to, for lack of a better description, in any of these types of cases, where you have, one massive superpower and, coming up against another, and someone is being torn to pieces in the tug of war between those parties, is that idea that these people, the ones that are actually suffering here, they are working people. They are average people. They are not part of the establishment, most of these people. They're not part of any ruling class, because if they were, they would have been evacuated safely and immediately, or they would have been treated with the type of respect that comes with their station, and they wouldn't have been put in harm's way in the first place. And so whether you're Ukrainian, whether you're Russian, or whether you are anyone else that is brought in as an auxiliary into this conflict, if you are in the conflict or collateral to that, you're a working person. And they are always the ones that suffer the most from any armed conflict situation. It is always working people that suffer. And so if anyone was to ask me, hey, Mystery, where do you sit on this conflict? I would say the same with any other type of warfare. I sit with the working class and I sit with working people. And so until there is a situation where the working masses of the world stand up and say, enough is enough, we're not going to take orders from a ruling class in whatever shape or way, that form that is, and we're not going to be sent to our deaths now for somebody else's agenda, that's the point at which we need to have discussions framed, not about who's good, who's bad, who should be taken down here. Let's and support this side so they can kill working people on that side. No, 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 no. How about we just get rid of all the nonsense and just go and, make this what it really should be about, is just class warfare at the end of the day. And if it is these two ruling classes or establishments that really want to pick fights with one another, let them fight it out. Let them have a crack. Get the leaders of these parties, these nations, these organizations. They can fight. And we can all watch. Wouldn't mind watching that. We can get them into a little gladiatorial arena or something like that. Let them slog it out between them instead of the millions or the thousands of working people that will be affected by conflicts. And so it's the same story anywhere. I can just overlay that opinion and put it on most things. It's always the average and the working class that is decimated in these types of situations. And so I know it might be a cop-out, but I stand with them.
Well, actually, I don't really think it is a cop-out, because it's a pretty common socialist and leftist point to just say, well, I know I'm not with an imperialist power, whether that's Russia or whether that's America. I'm with the little guy that's basically caught in the middle, whether that's a Russian soldier that to be honest, I don't know whether they've been conscripted or not. But let's say for argument's sake, they have been conscripted, or it's the Ukrainian person that's Ukrainian man that's basically protecting their hometown. To be honest, I think it's a viewpoint of, no, I stand with the worker. It's a viewpoint that Vicky 1999 has. So you're probably with good company there, Mr. E. Basically, well, from what you were talking about, I want to say 2 points from that is that I guess warfare being an ultimate evil. I think there's a common phrase in Western tradition. I think it goes that kill one man, you're a murderer, but kill 1,000 and you're a king. So I guess throughout history, it's very common that people that rule over other people, whether that is via the divine right of kings or they're elected as an official, via a parliament, or maybe even if you're to be a president, I don't know, maybe of America, I'm not sure. It's very common that, well, I guess if you're not on the front lines, you're very happy to, I guess, throw people to the wind. And I guess that's kind of the reason why you have nationalism, you have patriotism, because I guess to kind of take things back to Karl Marx, correct me if I'm wrong, back in his day, there wasn't such thing as a passport. There wasn't such thing as actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, this is a previous video of yours. They didn't have passports. You could very freely travel between countries. And I'm not saying that wars didn't happen before then, but when you have that kind of power structure, it's very easy at the top for you to send people to send other people to their deaths. And plus, at least from an Australian's perspective, I feel like even if people haven't experienced themselves, I'm sure they would have heard this in their textbook. They would have heard this from, or they would have read this from in their textbooks. They would have heard this from their their grandfathers or maybe even their great grandfathers that during the First World War, it's a very common story from Gallipoli with the Australian soldiers that their English officers, their British officers, told them when they didn't have any ammo in their guns to run at the Turks, who had massive Gatling guns, and they were like, "Yeah, just take back Gallipoli. We don't care that you have any ammo or anything to defend yourselves. We just want you to throw bodies and capture this little piece of land." So you don't have to look very far to gain some sort of empathy from Australians, because it's part of our identity to be battlers and roll up your sleeves and help everyone else, and that's like the founding tradition. So I guess if you just dig a little deeper, I think at least in Australian society, people would back the average worker. The other point that I want to bring is I think this is law and the philosophy of law of when you actually are debating someone, because whenever you have a point of argument, there's two ways you deal with it, especially if it's a wrong action that's been put towards you. And say, for example, you did something that was wrong, so X, you either have two choices. You either have an excuse, so you basically say to someone, yeah, I didn't really do that. That was actually this person over here. So you basically like try to deflect in some sort of circumstance. So to basically take culpability away from you. Now, the other one is justification. Now, justification is you admit that you did X. So, for example, and this is where this brings it back to war that I want to bring it back to, is you're a soldier and you are justified in killing someone because you were in a war.
Yeah.
So an excuse is, oh, I killed someone, but I didn't really do it because I was framed. And the justification part of it, which is very much part of our culture in Western society, is, oh, yes, I did kill that person, but I was a soldier in a war and I was defending myself. And that makes sense in an individual sense. Like, I guess if we were to take, the non-consequentialist idea of things, which is basically the idea of, you just look at yourself as an individual and did I do the right thing or didn't I do the right thing? Like that makes sense in if you're just looking at yourself individually. Like, oh, somebody tried to attack me. There was a struggle and yeah, okay, I accidentally killed them, but I was defending myself. Like that makes sense individually. But the thing is, we live in a society. So if you create that sort of justification, then, well, why can't you say there isn't a slippery slope? If you're giving yourself a license as an individual, then couldn't you give yourself that license as a group? Couldn't you give yourself that license as a society? Couldn't you give yourself that license as a nation? And then suddenly war's justified.
Yeah. Well, like, I think then it's very important in terms of justifying warfare, then to look at how the conversation is framed completely and utterly by mainstream media, especially in the West, because it is the global mainstream, I guess you would say, the conglomerates, the largest kind of, I guess, mouthpieces for what the issues of the day will be in terms of what will be discussed and what's on the day's agenda, all come from particular media sources. And that trickles down through to everything. Like traditionally, you'd start with some big, I guess you would say, media companies that kind of owned a number of smaller media organizations, and they would set the tone of the debate and what's acceptable to talk about, and frame that discussion, and then it rolled down from there. But even that extends today to the realms of social media, because the media sets the discussion, and then social media picks up on it, and then everyone takes their sides on that discussion within the realms of social media. They start tweeting about something, maybe they'll make some content about it, maybe they'll talk about it on their feeds or what have you. But the conversation is still framed in essence. And so from a Western perspective, you must be asking yourself, when you have a look at all of this, I believe, why is it that the story is being told from this perspective? And if it is one side of the perspective, then there must be a reason for that. You're not going to get objective analysis and objective stories from the mainstream media and then trickling down into all other forms of media. You're not going to get an objective perspective where they give you two sides of the argument that you were talking about before, a dialectical position, and then you come and meet in the middle, where you see where it contradicts one another and you formulate your own opinion. You're not going to get that by just studying what is being talked about and then technically what is trending as a result of that. And so you must be searching for your own kind of analysis within that. And so to take it back right to the beginning, that's why I do really think it's really important that you talk to people like you have, and you get the first-hand kind of understanding about what's happening on the ground and like what's happening to real people, because you do get those stories, but you get them framed in the narrative of the mega story structure that is being told to you on a daily basis through the lens of a Western perspective, as we're calling it, because we have access at the moment to Western media. I'm sure in Russia, then you would be having a very different perspective on the details of the war, or in any of its associated or allied countries. You'd be getting a very different perspective on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so, like, I think it's important, very important, for people to realize that when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, we really need to be asking the question, why is the conversation limited to good, bad, evil, exemplary, and telling stories of misery on one side and stories that make your blood boil about the other. It's the way that the conversation is framed. And this happens on any topic, but like you can see it in action and very acutely with the way that the Russia and Ukraine conflict is being delivered to us on a daily basis. You can see exactly, it's palpable what sentiment you should be feeling here. It's clear as.
Well, yeah, and I think there's an element to this as well of towing the line. And what I mean by that is, well, to bring it back to probably a different aspect of Econobabble, is there was another chapter when I was reading it that was very much talking about free trade agreements, and it did speak about it that, well, there actually is nothing free about free trade agreements. It basically was, let's take a classic example of champagne. So champagne is supposed to be from a specific part of France, and you can't call it champagne unless it's from that specific part of France. And it's those sort of things where they have free trade agreements with other countries to make sure that that branding it stays true. But also another aspect is, in the book he describes that so Australia can sell certain products overseas, like, say, for example, bananas, compared to, say, cotton or I think it was cotton as well as sugar from America, selling that to Australia. And basically, that was in that agreement, it embargoes Australia from selling those sort of products to America and like the other people that they've got free trade agreements with. The reason why they make these sort of deals is for many reasons, but one that's related to the topic we're talking about today is geopolitical reasons. So because AUKUS exists, that group that Australia and America are very much a part of, and those sort of groups happen, and it basically, these free trade agreements are basically a you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And it basically is one way for various countries to align themselves and basically create partnerships. So because Australia was backing America in these three free trade agreements, and it's basically one, like, what, it's not the only reason why they have a close relationship, but it's basically the icing on the cake, like the extra thing to solidify their relationship. I don't know, say for example, we were thrown into a situation where Australia was being quite warmongering towards China, which was a very possible situation about, a year ago, and they needed to be backed up from America. Those sort of free trade agreements and that sort of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, could be the one reason that America decides to help us out with that sort of situation. And I guess the reason why I want to kind of bring it back is, well, to just say that there's just one side of the conflict, or and then there's another side of the conflict, or that the world is a blank slate. That's just it. It's just not that simple. And when you actually analyze the media, they are effectively towing the line of how Australia views the conflict, which is going to be America aligned, is going to be NATO aligned, because they have these sort of agreements with these countries. They already have a long-standing relationship. It's you're not going to see Australia turn around and say, "Oh, NATO, why were you trying to convince Ukraine to join you?" That didn't seem like a good idea geopolitically. That's basically caused a scenario where hundreds, if not thousands, of people have died. Naughty. Like, no, they're not going to say that, because they have such a close relationship with members of NATO, such as Britain and others, various surrounding countries to Ukraine and Russia, and they're very closely aligned with America, which I guess you could argue from a Sun Tzu Art of War's perspective, it's to their advantage that Russia is being destabilized by this conflict.
Yes, and that's the thing. Like, you got to take everything that you're hearing in the media and the trickle down from that with a grain of salt, because it has to align with the ideology of the place that you are viewing it from, and that is a Western perspective, and it's a Western, Western view of the world. And so you're dealing with all these deeply ingrained and, in like these deeply connected relationships, and like the media narrative or the story about things will not deviate from those special ties, which are mostly economic on a geopolitical stage. And so, you must be considering that whenever you are formulating opinions on any type of warfare or conflict, especially with a scenario like this. And that's why it is safe to always retreat to, when in doubt, always go with the working people, the ones that are really the ones that are thrown in and suffer all of the losses and the consequences of these types of scenarios, because they're the only real people that lose out in the end on either side. It's the working people, the masses and the majority of us that are decimated. But like, I want to talk about, something, NATO basically, because it is something, a topic that I guess is taboo in a sense, or people don't really want to broach it from a Western perspective because, it's a hard conversation to grapple with. And I don't want to get into the, I guess, the ethics of the conversation, or maybe even, the morals behind anything. I just want to talk about where NATO has come from in essence. And like, NATO was established, post World War II, after the fall of fascism, when, free liberal kind of democratic countries allied with, the communist superpower to crush the evil threat of fascism that was going to threaten to take over the entire world. And they split, the European continent in half. And it became kind of this idea that, whoever controls kind of the Eurasian continent will basically be the one that has supremacy on the world stage. And when you split like the line down Eastern and Western kind of Europe, that was the new battle line that was going to be fought over for the rest of the 20th century between the great Western powers and the great Eastern powers, and communism versus capitalism and all that sort of stuff. NATO was established at that point at the behest of the Americans, who were coming in as the savior of Europe, and they were funding the restoration of Europe after the devastation of World War II. NATO was kind of the trade-off there, if we're going to talk about trade-offs and relations and all that sort of stuff. It was America who was coming in there, and they needed a coordinated militaristic presence there without being overtly like, let's just set up American army bases on the fringe of the communist kind of part of Europe. And so NATO was established with that idea in mind, was to contain the communist threat. Like, the communism was like a big part of the European identity all over Western Europe, not just Eastern Europe. There were communist parties, in Italy and France and Spain and England and, like all over Western Europe. And like, part of the deal when the Americans were coming in and providing basically financial aid and establishing things like NATO, but like financial aid to help rebuild all of these absolutely decimated European countries, they were doing so under the provision that these European countries would make sure that communist parties were not allowed to participate democratically in elections. and in the political process in all of these countries. So that's what they did from a political perspective, and then from a military perspective or a strategic perspective, they instituted NATO to stop any physical spread of communism into the Western European countries. And so when, I guess you could say, the Soviet Union crumbled eventually and fell, it was at that point that the original founders of NATO, the people that were in charge of it at the beginning, they wrote to NATO at the time, which wasn't dissolved, but was going to continue its presence and even ramp up some of its efforts at that point. And they said, look, there is no point for NATO anymore. NATO has served its purpose. It's protected the West from the evil threat of communism. It's over. It's done now. We can dissolve this and let the region get back to its own autonomy and political freedom, in a sense, without the presence of some militaristic organization that really protects vested interests in the region. And that never happened. It was never dissolved. So the conversation beyond that, though, about whether that's good, bad, ugly, or a great thing, that's a whole different conversation. But the original intention of that organization was fulfilled at the end or the fall of the Soviet Union. And the question is, why did it continue? And if you can answer that, I think you would have a very good understanding as to where we are today, if you could answer that. I'm not going to try and do that here.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good consideration.
Okay. I actually didn't know about that history about NATO. I'm kind of glad that you explained that. Is that the reason, like, so wait, what I got from that, is NATO the reason why there's such a thing as the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc? Or at least those kind of concept?
NATO was involved in terms of its intention was to support Western interests strategically, like basically along the border between East and West. And so it was there to make sure that the communist threat was contained. And so, like today, you have NATO bases with all of their missiles facing straight into, as close as you can get, into Russian territory. Because just in case that the threat of evil communism comes back. And Russia is not a Soviet country anymore. It's not part of, it's not openly a communist society at all. So why are these strategic points not only relinquished, but being potentially expanded on since the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s? So, yes, NATO would have helped define the borders between that line between East and West at some point, and it's continued to do so as times have changed. The Eastern Bloc countries have dissolved and they've sought to find, their own political autonomy, and NATO has been there as this kind of big presence in the region, offering its support, if you want to call it that, to certain regions where deemed appropriate. I'm not an expert in NATO, but if you look at it like the way it's developed, this is its progression and how it's been used since. And so the question is, you have to ask, you have to wonder why wasn't it dissolved when its initial objective ceased to have meaning anymore? It must have some other geopolitical importance.
Hmm.
The pertinent question, if we're going to talk about Russia and the Ukraine and people come in with the N-word.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I feel like we've had a pretty good conversation today. Very enlightening, Mr. E. As always, what's that synthwave art in the background? You can definitely tell the AI had a day of it because they decided to create a tank out the front and destroyed buildings in the back, which, as you can probably tell what the prompt was, it was Russia in the Ukrainian conflict. And with that, guys, that was the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. Remember all to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, Mr. A.
Thank you very much, 4IS, and for all of you out there. Please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.